afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. There we go. Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth lecture in this year's Whitehall Lecture Series. This is our 30th year of presenting the Whitehall Lecture Series. Happy to see you all here this afternoon. My name is John Blades. I'm the director of the Flagler Museum. Let me take just a couple of minutes first to thank the Education Department staff and the Curatorial Department staff for working behind the scenes on the logistics of this lecture and the entire series to make things run smoothly. Let me remind you to turn off your cell phones. Please don't assume they're off. Please take a minute to make sure they're off. And if you happen to wander into the room with one of those audio tour ones, would you hold that up so the staff can collect it? There's a built-in alarm on that audio tour one that sometimes is set off by the AV system in this room, and if that happens, you'll be the center of attention for a few minutes. We'd like to avoid that. I'm sure you'd like to avoid that too. I want to remind all of you that all of our lectures at the museum are webcast live, so if there's, for some reason, you can't join us here in the Grand Ballroom of Whitehall for one of our lectures, you can certainly link to this webcast live through the museum's webpage, through the Whitehall the Lecture Series webpage. See the same slides that are being presented to the audience here in the Grand Ballroom, and hear the audio, and then ask questions even. In fact, a number of people have joined us for today's lecture, so I should say welcome to those who've joined us via the internet. We also archive all of our lectures on a website we created called the GildedAgeHistoryChannel.com. There are more than 100 videos there. And the lectures from this year's series will be added to those videos. It's a great resource for learning about America's Gilded Age. I want to thank our sponsors for this year's Whitehall Lecture Series, Max and Victoria Dreyfus Foundation and the Palm Beach Post for helping to make this possible. You have at your seats a season program guide, a guide to all the programming here during the 2014-15 season at the Flagler Museum, as well as a postcard reminding you that our fifth and final lecture will be on March 22nd on the Lincoln Memorial. James Percoco, you probably already know, was scheduled earlier in the series but couldn't get out of Washington, D.C. because of the weather. He's going to try again on March 21st to get down here to Palm Beach. We hope he'll have better luck then, and we'll enjoy his lecture on the 27th for the fifth and final lecture of the series. Today's lecture on Mount Rushmore will be given by David Wolff, who is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Professor of History at Black Hills State University. So we're talking about his neck of the woods. I believe he's currently the President of the Board of Trustees for the South Dakota State Historical Society, Chairman of the Board for the Directors of the Adams Museum and House in Deadwood, and President of the Mining History Association, as well as a member of the Board of Directors for the South Dakota State Railroad Museum in Hill City. He lives in a town whose name I really love, Spearfish, South Dakota. That's perfect. I wish I lived in Spearfish. Has a nice ring to it. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. David Wolff to the Whitehall Lecture Series.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many here. I never realized that so many people in this part of the world cared about Mount Rushmore at all. Of course, we in the Black Hills appreciate Mount Rushmore, but each in our own different way. Today we're going to talk about Mount Rushmore in a variety of formats. Talk about how it's constructed, talk about its interpretations, talk about how its interpretations have changed over the years, I should say. Before I do that, I want to just kind of emphasize how special a place this is for me. My family is from the Black Hills, and as a youth I heard stories of the carving of Mount Rushmore from my grandmother and my father. 1969, I worked for the concessionaire. In the dining room there was a chef's assistant, and a great summer learning more about Mount Rushmore. And then in 2005, I was teaching a whole series of years of graduate classes at Mount Rushmore, and I met my charming wife there. So Mount Rushmore is a very special place. When the Flagler Museum invited me, I looked at what they said about the interpretations of Mount Rushmore. They write that it's the most enduring and impressive monument to the American character. They write that this monument symbolizes the spirit, soul, mind, and body of America. That Washington represents the spirit, Lincoln the soul, Jefferson the intellect and enlightenment, and Roosevelt represents the body of America, or its physical prowess and enormous energy. As we look at Mount Rushmore today, we'll keep those in mind and talk about other interpretations, what is meant to other people over time. Before I do that, I want to make darn sure we know where Mount Rushmore is. It's amazing how many people think Mount Rushmore somehow is in North Dakota, but it's not. It's in South Dakota, in the very western edge of South Dakota, in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I've got a pointer here, which right up there. This map's kind of localized. There's North Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming. You can figure out those states, we got to figure it out. So Mount Rushmore is in the very western end of South Dakota. The Black Hills of South Dakota, a small mountain outcropping, has been a contested land for some time. To give a little history, a number of Indian groups have gone through the Black Hills and claimed it as home. The Kiowa, the Crow, the Cheyenne, and most recently in our own memory is the Lakota or the Sioux Indians have called the Black Hills home. Of course, they were extracted from that home when the Black Hills Gold Rush came in 1875-76, and the federal government ripped the Black Hills out of the Great Sioux Reservation in 1877, which many of the Lakota or the Sioux still call the theft of the Black Hills. And of course, this theft of the Black Hills still plays into some dimensions of how the Black Hills is, or how Mount Rushmore is interpreted within the Black Hills setting. Well, let's start at the beginning and do a little history about the idea and the carving of Mount Rushmore. In the southern Black Hills, there's a whole series of granite spires. These granite spires have various names, such as the Needles and the Cathedral Spires. They surround the highest peak in the Black Hills called Harney Peak. In 1923, a man by the name of Doane Robinson, who happened to be the South Dakota state historian, said, you know, look at these granite spires. We could carve images into those. And he said, maybe we should carve Red Cloud up there. Or maybe as he thought about his idea more, he said, let's carve Buffalo Bill Cody. Let's carve George Custer. Let's carve John Fremont, the great pathfinder. And then tourists, as he thought, would have something impressive to see when they came to the Black Hills. He knew there was already scenery. In fact, just south of this area, a recent creation of a state park had occurred, Custer State Park, which a number of tourists were coming to see. But he felt scenery wore people out. They were bored easily. So he wanted to create something impressive. And he knew that South Dakota needed more tourism. This is 1923. South Dakota had already slipped into the Great Depression. Agricultural prices had collapsed after World War I. Farmers in South Dakota were struggling mightily, and South Dakota's economy was suffering. So he said this would give us a boost to tourism. Well, mountain carvings then, in the Needles. He contacted a sculptor by the name of Laredo Taft, some considered the greatest sculptor of that era, and he declined the offer to come to the Black Hills to carve this. Then in mid-1924, he invited Gutzon Borglum. Borglum at that time was doing a mountain carving in Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia, which we'll talk about in a second. And he sent the letter down to Stone Mountain, Georgia. Doane Robinson sent the letter down there. Borglum was not there. His assistant, a guy by the name of J.G. Tucker, got the letter, got excited by the letter. He wrote at the bottom, "Here it is, Borglum, let's go." He knew that Borglum, even though he's working on this carving at Stone Mountain, always wanted to do what they called a great national memorial in the north. And this was that opportunity. So while still engaged at Stone Mountain in 1924, he left and came to Black Hills to take a look. This is the protagonist of the story, Gutzon Borglum, who in 1924 was 57 years old. Gutzon Borglum came from a poor background, born in Idaho, raised kind of in a transient lifestyle, and rose up to be successful based on his painting and then sculpting skills. Because of his upbringing, he always had sympathy for the poor and for the people who rose up. Because of his own success and because of the mentality of the time, he became highly patriotic. We hear about it here in the Flagler Museum, how people of the Gilded Age are highly patriotic, and so was he. He had unbounded charisma. People followed him because he was who he was. He could influence people easily with who he was, including presidents, and he had segues in with various presidents. But he also could be self-righteous, demand special treatment. He was a freewheeler. When people didn't do what he exactly wanted, he accused them of having conspiracies to make him fail. He was a man that expected a lot of other people, and he would back down to no one. Well, his most famous carvings at this time, when he was contacted, or his ones he liked the most, I should say, were his work on Lincoln. He was a real Lincoln enthusiast. This sculpture he did in 1908, it sits in the crypt of the U.S. Capitol, his 40-inch high head of Lincoln. If you've ever been to Lincoln's tomb in Springfield, Illinois, the bronze of this sits in front of Lincoln's tomb. This was his favorite subject. He believed Lincoln should be his. When the commission went out for the Lincoln Memorial, which you'll hear about in a couple weeks, he felt that commission should be his. And when he didn't get it and the Lincoln Memorial was done, Borglum was highly critical, saying all that there is in the Lincoln Memorial is nothing but marble, expressionless marble. He also felt that other memorials to the nation's leaders, such as Washington, were poorly done and did not reflect the dimensions, the dynamics that should represent these people. Hence, Mount Rushmore was this chance to do a carving of the Black Hills, was this chance for him to fulfill this dream. He believed at this time that colossal art, huge undertakings, is what should represent this American society, civilization, as he would say. He says size meant triumph, size meant immortality. It would be enduring remembrance. He would represent the expanding character of American civilization. So he came to Black Hills in 1924 with that in mind. But as I mentioned, while he was coming to Black Hills, he was still working on Stone Mountain, Georgia. There was a mountain outside of Georgia, which maybe some of you have been to, called Stone Mountain. It used to be about 16 miles from Atlanta. Atlanta's grown a lot, so it's much closer. And prior to World War I, the Daughters of the Confederacy had contracted him to come do a mountain carving there. They asked him first to do a head of Lee and put it on the side of Stone Mountain. He agreed, but he said instead, that would just be like pasting a postage stamp on the side of a house. He wanted something dynamic, strong, and vibrant. So instead of just putting Lee's head up there, he proposed, and he started carving Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, all on their horses, leading men, horses, other units of the cavalry, and leading them into immortality. He started working on this after World War I and was working on it in 1924 when Don Robinson from South Dakota contacted him. He'd already completed Lee's head and had dedicated Lee's head when he came to South Dakota. But the events at Stone Mountain, Georgia blew apart, and maybe Borglum wanted to have him blow apart. He was unhappy with the people who tried to control him, the Memorial Commission. He was unhappy they hadn't raised enough money, which he demanded, always. They were unhappy with Borglum because he said he spent money too freely and he left the work all the time, just like when he came to South Dakota. And he did other commissions. In 1925, conveniently for Borglum, you might say, the commission down at Stone Mountain fired him for offensive egotism and delusions of grandeur. Borglum, being Borglum, had his models in a studio outside the front of Stone Mountain. He went there promptly and smashed all his models, said nobody could do his work, and he fled the state. And he went to work on his great Northern Memorial, which of course would be a chance to redeem him. I want to comment on this picture. This is the image that is at Stone Mountain, Georgia today, more or less. This is a rendering that's in Keystone, South Dakota, just 3 miles from Mount Rushmore. There's a museum there called the Borglum Museum. I'm not sure why they have this on display, because after Borglum left, they blew off Lee's head, and they started over some years later, and this is what it looks like more or less at Stone Mountain. It's not Borglum's work, but it's down in his museum. But there's some explanations for museums we just can't understand. He came to the Black Hills in 24 then. While he was working on Stone Mountain, he also came in early 1925. This is a picture again of some of the granite spires around Harney Peak. The highest mountain there, kind of right in the center, is Harney Peak, the highest mountain in the Black Hills. Of course, you know, when you're in the Black Hills, you always got to brag about things. A little digression here. It's the highest peak in the Black Hills at 7,242 feet, so which isn't very darn high when you come from the Rocky Mountains. So people in the Black Hills like to say, we're the highest peak east of the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Alps. When he got to the Black Hills, those various trips, to talk to Don Robinson and others about this great national memorial, he immediately threw out Don Robinson's idea of Red Cloud and these other Western leaders. He made it clear it was really a great national memorial. He said it had to represent America's geographical expansion, and political development. He immediately said, maybe I need to put Washington and Lincoln up there. That's going back to what he thought about the work that had been done on Washington and Lincoln. He also had to figure out a better location. The Needles are a unique formation, quite lovely to visit, and he was getting a lot of, and Don Robinson was getting a lot of kickback, that you can't carve in the Needles. They are already perfectly done. And just carving them would ruin them. And any head stuck on a needle would be like a totem pole. Borglum said, well, you're right. I don't want to carve the Needles. I will instead carve 2 or 3 colossal figures on Harney Peak, which is up there in the center. Well, he would not carve Harney Peak. Instead, he would carve a mountain called Mount Rushmore. And this is, of course, blank Mount Rushmore. In a third trip to the Black Hills in August 1925, he came to find his mountain. As the Rapid City Journal reported, he came to chart Harney Peak. But he didn't look at Harney Peak. With his son in tow, Lincoln Borglum, he named his own son after Lincoln, that's how much he liked Lincoln, Lincoln Borglum, and a state forester named Theodore Shoemaker, they went out to look for the right mountain to carve. Shoemaker knew the Black Hills very well, at least that section, and he took him by a number of mountains which he knew would be unsuitable, and he gets him in front of Mount Rushmore, and he says, I think this is the spot, Gutson. And Gutson said, well, I don't know, but what about that mountain right behind it? And about a half-mile behind was a mountain that had a name called Old Baldy. And he looked at Old Baldy and said, I can see Washington's head here. I can see Lincoln's head here. And as he got closer looking at Old Baldy, they recognized that deep crevices and cracks, which would make mountain carving difficult. So he returned to Mount Rushmore, and he recognized there's cracks, flaws in this as well, but it could be workable. Also, it faced his favorite direction, south and east, so it'd have good sun most of the time for people to come and visit. And this then was the mountain. Once he decided, he sat down and started making a little drawing of Washington's head and how it would look on Mount Rushmore. I want to digress a couple points here. Mount Rushmore. How do we get a name like Mount Rushmore? That's a name we all know now. Who is this Rushmore guy? Huh? Rushmore is named after Charles Rushmore. He was a New York City attorney. Charles Rushmore had been coming to the Black Hills working for a mining company called the Harney Peak Tin Company in 1885. They had a bunch of claims around Harney Peak, and every day for several days, Rushmore went on a horseback ride with a guide checking out these mining claims. They passed by this formation, and Charles Rushmore asked the guide, what's the name of this? And the guide supposedly responded, it never had a name, but it has now. We'll call the damn thing Rushmore. So thanks to this whimsical question, you might say, and this half-hearted comment, we have our national memorial named Mount Rushmore. And I think about that. Initially, Borglum wanted to pick Old Baldy. Just think, millions of tourists a year could be going to Black Hills to see Old Baldy, as opposed to Mount Rushmore. And Rushmore is a good name. It has that uplifting sound I guess we all appreciate. Well, it was a given as Rushmore took form that Lincoln, Washington would be on there. There's probably no question. But there's some debate about how the third and fourth heads got placed on Mount Rushmore, how they were chosen. I think if you look at this model of Guts and Borglum he's in front of he's doing, it's pretty evident that the third head was Jefferson. You can see Jefferson just to the left of Washington's head. So to me, Jefferson was his third choice, even though there's still some disagreement about that. And why did he choose Jefferson? He was the great expansionist. That's what Borglum appreciated about this country, expansion and growth. Political development, expansion, and growth. He didn't even mention the Declaration of Independence, which now is given so much credit, or Jefferson's given so much credit for. So Jefferson certainly came in, I think, third. The fourth choice, of course, was very controversial, and that's Theodore Roosevelt. This is 1925. Roosevelt's been dead 6 years. Do you memorialize somebody in stone whose legacy has yet to really be determined? How did Roosevelt get chosen? Well, Borglum would like to defer blame, if blame was to be deferred, to a senator from South Dakota named Peter Norbeck. Norbeck was a progressive Republican, a friend of Theodore Roosevelt's. Borglum says, it was Norbeck's idea, he did it. He made me do it. Borglum was lying. He's not here to defend himself, is he? In fact, I'm absolutely convinced that, also Gutzon Borglum admired Theodore Roosevelt. He admired him, as he said, he was part of this next great expansionism in the United States. How was Roosevelt part of a great expansionist? Because of the acquisition of the Panama Canal, something that Borglum highly supported. So we get now 4 heads up there. Some people say he chose 4 heads because he just wanted the thing big, and he liked big stuff. Who knows? So this monument now, we got 4 heads he's chosen, not necessarily in this order. He'll have to move things around as the mountain changes. But selections and the interpretations of this mountain are Borglum's. He makes the choice. It's his ideas. So this monument is vision of Borglum. And it's not about people individually. It's about an idea and an ideal. As he said at the time, it's about the commemoration, foundation, preservation, and continental expansion of the United States. Well, we're looking at a variety of people that made this happen. Here in front of the barely started Mount Rushmore is one of the Mount Rushmore commissions. He went to the Mount Harney Commission, 2 Mount Rushmore commissions, and others. These people were responsible for managing the business, raising the money, and making it happen. Within this picture are Don Robinson, and there's a guy in a bow tie, if I can see him in here, he's over here someplace. There's a guy in a boat right there. That's Don Robinson. And this guy right there is John Boland. John Boland was the business manager, and for 6-7 years he tried to run the business of carving Mount Rushmore while Borglum did the work. Borglum didn't like any control. He complained about too much constraint. He complained about not enough money whenever there was money to be had. And Boland took most of this grief. Why didn't this blow apart? Borglum just stacked grief on everybody, like he did at Stone Mountain. Well, interpretation today that these people in South Dakota, like John Boland, wanted this to happen. Boland wanted it to happen because it's a commercial venture. He was from Rapid City. He saw the money. He saw tourism, just like Don Robinson. But as Boland hung on, he recognized that this would be a great thing, commemorating the ideals of America. Why didn't Borglum quit and run away? He was so upset, and as he threatened from time to time, he knew at his age, in the 60s, getting there, this is his last chance to do his great national memorial. So they hung together through thick and thin. Other people that are important, and some of these people, one person in this picture should be familiar to, is Calvin Coolidge. That's his wife, Grace. This is Senator Peter Norbeck, Congressman William Williamson, all from the 2 Congress people are from South Dakota. These people, the 2 congressmen, the senator and the House and the representative, were the people that helped guide much of the Mount Rushmore legislation through Congress. When the federal government started kicking in money, it was these 2 men who made that money come aboard. And in 1927, they convinced Calvin Coolidge to spend the summer in the Black Hills. As you know, back in the good old days before air conditioning, presidents left Washington, D.C. to go vacation someplace else in the summer, and he spent the summer of 1927 in the Black Hills, in Custer State Park. These men worked hard to get Coolidge there, and then ultimately Coolidge to Mount Rushmore. And we'll see what effect that has in a minute. And of course, there's the workers. The monument's almost done here, and here are the workers involved. As many as 400 men worked at Mount Rushmore at a time, from time to time. This picture shows around 24 of them, and that's what probably at one time, at any one given time, 24 men worked on Rushmore. And of this group, only only a small group were really truly a core that hung on through thick and thin. Because for 14 years of carving, they started in 1927, runs to 41, they only carved really for 6.5 years because of weather problems and money problems. But many of these men, the core group, would stay on, come back. When they were laid off, they'd go down to Keystone, the nearby town they came from, and they would do other jobs. Why did they hang around? They made good wages. They made $1.25 an hour if you were a carver, 75 cents an hour if you were a driller, when coal miners at the time were making 25 cents an hour. Borglum always complained about the people who were unskilled. These were untrained miners when they started, untrained with mountain carving. Everybody's untrained, but they managed to make it work. What did they think about the job? Well, they were happy to have the job. This was during the hard times in South Dakota and then the nation in the 1930s. But they saw it as a crazy kind of job. But as they were there, the core group hung on and came to appreciate it as being a place that represented the ideals of America. But it's interesting, a few of these carvers wrote, yeah, Borglum has all these great ideas. He tells us how to do them. Then we do them. We make it look great, and he takes credit. They wrote, he's a faker. But I think not all people were that bitter. One thing that Borglum liked to do is have dedications. So in 1925, this is before Coolidge showed up, he had his first dedication to the mountain. This is when he thought he'd start carving in 1925. So he's on top of Mount Rushmore, and what he does, he gets some natives up there, and he hoists up and down flags. The newspapers publicize this, some 1,000 people are below the mountain as he talks about what he hopes to do. As he raises and lowers flags, what he's trying to do, he raises a French flag, a Spanish flag, a flag he says represents the 13 colonies, then an American flag. He talks about the various people who've tried to own this or have owned this mountain. And so part of his big theme is about the geographical expansion of this country. He made all these dedications, and we'll talk about more dedications of this mountain because of the publicity. He's trying to raise money, he's trying to bring attention. He's trying to win people over. And in 1925, he did win people over. Except when he departed the Black Hills, he said, before I come back, we need to have the Black Hills people raise $50,000 to make this happen. That's on the heels of not saying too long before that he would carve it at no expense to the people of Black Hills. But that was a Gutzon Borglum way. It took 2 years, nothing happened, till 1927 when Coolidge does come to the Black Hills, and Coolidge is convinced to come to Mount Rushmore. He does give a speech, and this is probably one of the most important speeches that happens at Mount Rushmore. In this picture, you can see Gutzon Borglum there in the background. I love the fact that Calvin Coolidge is wearing his cowboy boots. He rode a horse from Keystone 2 or 3 miles up the hillside, so he proved that he could handle whatever came at him. As the president, he said, we've come here to dedicate the cornerstone that was laid by the hand of the Almighty. He said, this memorial will be another national shrine to which generations will repair to declare their continuing allegiance to independence, to self-government, to freedom, and to economic justice. And he goes on and says, the courage of the South Dakotans to build a great national monument had been so great, they deserve the sympathy and support of the national government. So here's Calvin Coolidge, as you all know, is very famous for being very watchful of economic resources, is saying the federal government should help support this national monument. And Norbeck and Williamson are sitting in the crowd, they're taking notes. We're heading back to Washington, and we're making a case for what he said. After Coolidge gave his speech, he handed some drill bits to Gutzon Borglum. He went up the mountain, carved out the main points of Washington's head, and that was the start of Rushmore. This happened in August 1927, and they carved for 2 or 3 more months. And they were out of money. Nothing happened in 1928. In 1929, late 1928, Peter Norbeck Williamson managed to get a bill through Congress using Coolidge's words that government money should be brought in. So they got a bill that gave Mount Rushmore $250,000, but on a matching basis. It had to be matched. Norbeck came back and said, what if the money we've already spent matches? And they said, okay, so we get $100,000 from what they had raised, the match. And so then in 1929, more carving resumed. And in 1930, Washington's head started to emerge. And in July 1930, they would dedicate Washington's head. At this time, Borglum had invited President Hoover, but he wouldn't come. He didn't have influence on Hoover like he had on other presidents. And so the chairman of the Mount Rushmore Commission spoke, and he said this, we shall now call this America's Shrine for Political Democracy, which then became shortened to, we shall call this the Shrine of Democracy. That was a name that they hoped to implant in 1930 that would carry on till today. That nobody would be saying Mount Rushmore, they would be saying, this is the Shrine of Democracy. Well, that did not stick. They did draw a big flag over the top of the Washington's head, and 2,000 some people watched the dedication of Washington. Shortly after Washington was dedicated, you can see off to the right, Gutzon Borglum started carving an inscription. And if you look carefully, it says 1776. He said, we can't carve these heads up there and have no definition of who they are, no explanation of what they stood for. And in fact, when Coolidge was there, he told Coolidge, you write me a story, a 500-word version of American history. American history in 500 words, that's a trick. And we'll carve it up there. And then so Coolidge did it. Borglum gets it, of course he doesn't like it. And he rewrites it. And he starts carving his version. And that's 1776 is the start of his version. Then the story comes out that Coolidge did this, he's not going to be put up there, what's going to happen? And it became a big brouhaha. Well, Coolidge said, I don't need any of this. And he said, don't use it, I don't care. And so he withdrew from it. And what the point becomes mute, however, because very soon, because of the changes they have to make on the mountain, they will have to blow away the inscription, and that fight will diminish or just go away about Coolidge's inscription versus Borglum's. Some historians argue that this fight made all the newspapers between Borglum and Coolidge, and indeed caused more people to want to come and visit. An interesting thing happened, in 1931 they ran out of money again, but in 1932 Congress had created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which had some relief money for the Depression. Norbeck got $150,000 of the relief money sent to South Dakota, which was supposed to help all South Dakotans who needed help. But then he got $50,000 of it set aside for Mount Rushmore. A third of the money to South Dakota, which caused a lot of people in South Dakota to say, what is going on here? Then he went to the federal government and said, we got $50,000 of this RFC money, that's our match with the other money you passed. And they bought it. So they got $100,000 then to move forward to continue the carving. And the carving continued into 1933. As you can see, Jefferson Head emerges on the Washington's right. We see him on the left. This carving was done when Borglum was away from the memorial. He was gone a lot. And this emerged. And when he gets back, he first sees, oh, that looks great. Things are fine. It's just what he wanted. 2 weeks later, he looked at it. He reported to the paper that gross errors had occurred. The person in charge lacked watchfulness, and he was disobedient. And he immediately fired the head carver, a guy named Villa, for doing this. Villa responded, there was never enough rock there. I was trying to do the best I could. It's Borglum's mistake for putting Jefferson in the wrong spot. Nevertheless, Villa was gone. Borglum looked at this head that would not work at that spot and blew it away, costing around $10,000 in money in the lost coffers. And then he had to readjust his memorial. Here's another model, and he continually shifted things around. A model showing Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. This man standing on top of the newly relocated Jefferson Head, taking a measurement. And what he's doing is measuring this model from the center of its head, then dimensions down to its nose and the eyes, and then they would transfer those same dimensions down to the face, and you can see on the use this, I guess. You can see this is their pointer, go down to point, just take him off the model, and that's how they do it. Of course, Borglum, when he's there, shows up and makes the adjustments. One adjustment he had to make while he was doing Jefferson is where he originally placed it here, a crack ran across the nose, a flaw in the mountain. And he saw that flaw through the nose, and he said, I don't want his nose to fall off 500 or 5,000 years from now. So he tilted the head back, and the crack now goes through the upper right eye, or the upper lip and the right eye, a place that he says is held harmless. Another change he made after the blow-up is himself getting more involved, but how did he get more involved in part? By bringing on his son. Lincoln Borglum, 21 years old initially in 1933, would take a job, an upper-level job on Mount Rushmore, very rapidly rise to superintendent. The men who he worked with under him were immediately suspicious of Lincoln Borglum doing this important job, not having trained, but soon Lincoln Borglum proved to be the exact right man to do this. Lincoln Borglum could deal with his father. He could deal with the workers. Gutzon Borglum liked to blow up at his men and fire them on the spot. And Lincoln Borglum would take him aside later and hire him back. So he was the man that became most involved when Gutzon was away to take care of Mount Rushmore. Another important dedication day was in 1936 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt showed up. Roosevelt was on his tour of Dust Bowl towns. You can see Roosevelt in the car there, speaking to the microphone. And he came to Mount Rushmore. He originally wasn't going to speak, but Borglum shoved the microphone into his face. And he said eloquently what he thought this would mean to Americans in the future. And he went on to say, this inspires democratic government here and throughout the world. And said, in essence, it deserves more federal support. So the carving continues with federal support, 35, 1936, 37. They do well. And this is by 1939. This is a new studio built in 1939 here. It's a new sculpture studio. You can't see it, but the mountain's out this window. Here's what the mountain finally is supposed to look like as he's moved them around. And that's where they are by 39. In 1937, Lincoln's head was dedicated. In 1939, Roosevelt's head was dedicated as they moved right along with the federal support. There were some controversies and some things that didn't go well, I guess you could say, from Borglum's perspective. One of these was creating a Hall of Records. First he wanted the inscription, then he wanted a Hall of Records. And he said this Hall of Records would contain the records of the West world, its accomplishments, its ventures in science, art, literature, invention, and medicine, preserved for all eternity. Not only would this big archives be behind this mountain, he said there'll also be statues, 25 large busts commemorating other Americans who didn't make the front side. And Mount Rushmore, if you don't know, there's a canyon right here. In fact, Roosevelt's head's pushed back so far, if he goes back another 6 inches, he's falling into the canyon. And so he saw that back here, he was going to carve a Hall of Records. And that's the start of the Hall of Records. Well, none of the commissions that had worked with Borglum initially authorized the Hall of Records. But for a brief time in 1938, Borglum had unlimited control. He gained control himself. And so what he decided to do was put in a Hall of Records. And for 1 year, he carved this 14 by 20 foot hole, 75 deep in the mountain, costing $16,000, before the National Park Service finally took control and said, we don't need no Hall of Records. And that came to a stop. Another controversy, as I mentioned, there's Gutzon Borglum up there on the mountain making final contact, comments about Roosevelt's head, about adjustments for it. Another conflict is about who should be up there. Woodrow Wilson was mentioned as being up there because Roosevelt was up there. That was dismissed. Another person to be mentioned was Susan B. Anthony. The advocates who wanted Susan B. Anthony up there started working in 1927, and they said, the monument will not tell the whole truth unless some reference is made into part of women in America's history. And so they went on and on. Even in Congress, the supporters got some bills introduced that did not go far to put a woman on Mount Rushmore. Borglum kept saying, there's not enough rock, we can't do it. He ultimately compromised. He said, we'll put one in the back, along with others, we'll really make a great place for commemoration of women. But most people say Borglum only gave in with that because he needed more money and more support. But nevertheless, that was another controversy that circulated about who would be on the mountain. Here's a picture of Mount Rushmore, just about done in 1939. It was at this time that Gutzon Borglum had been feeling ill. In 1940, he had gone in for surgery. In 1941, he went in for repeat surgery in the Chicago hospital, and while there, he died of a heart attack. With this death, Congress declared Mount Rushmore complete. There was $50,000 still in the Treasury, and so Lincoln Borglum was assigned the task of finishing the monument. And what he did is he made some final touch-ups. But Lincoln Borglum said, this monument, the faces are good. We don't need to put them down to the waist like my father wanted. But he said, get rid of the rubble, for God's sake. He said, the rubble diminishes the view and limits the grandness of the mountain. He says, also finish the Hall of Records. Also put a stairway up the side. That's the way you get the Hall of Records right there. I probably shouldn't tell you that, right? That's the way you sneak up behind Mount Rushmore. And you need to do that. So Lincoln was fine with the heads, but he wanted some other work done. In the end, when Lincoln Borglum had the mountain shut down, it was shut down on October 31st, 1941, and men started dismantling. Of course, with World War II coming, no more money would have come anyway. It was reported in his final report that 450,000 tons of stone had been removed from the mountain. The memorial cost $989,000 to build. Of that, $836,000 came from the federal government. $170,000 went to Gutzon Borglum for an honorarium. It was unlike many projects at the time. It started with only local support, got federal matching money, and then very soon it became a federal project. Now, Mount Rushmore is about, in Don Robinson's estimation, to make something special of interest so people could get a fuller impression when they're tourists. Other things were done to do that. Peter Norbeck designed a road. This is called the Iron Mountain Highway. And he really wanted to give the tourist a full experience, and this senator could do everything. So he laid out a road that goes between Custer State Park to the south of Mount Rushmore, to Mount Rushmore, and you go through 3 tunnels, and every time you go through a tunnel, you see Mount Rushmore. So if you're ever there, make sure you go to Iron Mountain Road. Other ways to see Mount Rushmore to get one of these special interest views is off to the side, where you can, on one of the U.S. highways that leads there, you get this great side view of Washington. And the only reason you see that is because Jefferson's head was blown away. That's still there. You wouldn't see Washington so well. And living up to the wishes of the Borglum family, something we can't see, but in 1998, the Park Service put a 4-foot deep vault in the Hall of Records. Here's Mary Ellis Borglum, Gutzon Borglum's daughter, and some other Borglum family. And they put in there 16 porcelain plates. These plates contain the text of our founding documents, a brief history of the United States, and a history of the monument. Let's talk briefly about interpretations. The Park Service's interpretation of this is pretty much based, if you get their standard interpretation, as in their museum, based on what Borglum thought. The founding, growth, preservation, development of the United States. That's in their museum, proudly posted. Since that posting, since that's our basic interpretation, other things have been added. Roosevelt's efforts at conservation have also been emphasized. That wasn't even thought, he's creating national monuments and parks. Now it is. Jefferson's use of the Declaration of Independence, or authoring of that, is now mentioned. That was never a part. And now a big part of Mount Rushmore's interpretation is diversity. It says, as they have posted, over the decades, Mount Rushmore has grown in fame as a symbol of America, a symbol of freedom and hope from all cultures and backgrounds. All the cultures that make up the fabric of this country are represented by the memorial and surrounding Black Hills. I wanted to find out, so that's their interpretations. What do visitors take away? So I went to Mount Rushmore, as my wife and I took a tour in preparation of this talk. So I went to the frontline staff operating the museum. I said, what do the visitors think when they come through here? And I got the very cogent response, well, I don't know. I'm not a visitor. Oh, I know you're not, but don't you talk to him? Okay. So I then went to the chief of interpretation, and she said, most people come here, if you ask them, say it's on their bucket list. Meaning that they come here because it's become an iconic national memorial, and they're on their way to Yellowstone. So coming or going, they're seeing this. But she says they do recognize it as a symbol of American history and patriotism. Do people see it as art? And art critics would probably call it not much art, but the figures are nicely done. They have life and vigor, and the people are impressed by that. Your takeaway from Mount Rushmore as a visitor all depends on how long you stay. If you drive by, it's just a fancy big carved rock. If you stay, you can get a full dose of interpretation. I alluded to the fact that this was a Native American land at one time. What's the Native American interpretation? This picture shows Ben Black Elk. For 30 years, 1940 to 1970, Ben Black Elk came there every day, not every day, just about every day in the summer to visit with tourists. He sometimes is called the fifth face of Mount Rushmore. He got his picture made many times. So he had an understanding, but not all natives do. In 1970, a group of natives came to the visitor center, started protesting about a land swap going on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The federal government was involved. They didn't like it. Very soon, leaders of the American Indian movement came to Mount Rushmore, and they took the mountain. They charged up the top. The rangers were ill prepared. They couldn't stop them, and they took up camp in the valley behind the heads. And the Park Service didn't know how to respond. They were worried about the consequences. They didn't know. They waited them out. After a number of days, the Indians started coming off the mountain. Just a couple left, and they finally got tired and left. When the Park Service went up there to take a look, their worst fears were realized in some way. There were many buckets of red paint. And they had the greatest fear that the red paint would have been dumped down the faces of Mount Rushmore, but it was not. The next year, they were worried the natives would return, and they did. This time, the park rangers were armed and dangerous, and they stopped it from in fact, they drug them off the mountain. And in more recent years, they've really tried to increase the understanding with the native groups. From 2006 to 2010, Gerard Baker, a Hidatsa Mandan native, was the superintendent of the park, and he increased the native interpretation dramatically. And other protests have happened there. What do locals think about it? Many times locals take this monument for granted. It's on our license plates, it's on our driver's license, it's there. But we do see the great economic advantage, no question. But when the locals get agitated, it's when the Park Service decides to change interpretations in some way. This was the old visitor center, built in 1950s. It stood until the 1990s, a very Western feel, wide open. The concession stand was down the path. And around you were the beautiful black hills, the spires and the peaks that inspired Borglum and the mountains. Well, the Park Service said this was not large enough. This was not adequate enough. So they knocked it down. And this is the concession building, and then they built a new park interpretation building down the way. And the locals were outraged. You cannot stand on these visitor platforms today and see the grandeur of the Black Hills. You cannot see the way Guts and Borglum wanted the mountain to be seen. And the locals are quite agitated. And then some people say with all these crossing beams, these gates, now you can get, when you go through the last gate, there's like four of them, that you can stand and see the mountain uninhibited, but it still diminishes the size. So there's lots of controversy about what has been done by the Park Service at the mountain with this route. One other side note about this, they also put in a parking garage. You used to park free. Well, now you park your car for $11. Now get this. When Borglum carved it, he said we should never charge a fee. This is a great memorial for all Americans. Every piece of legislation that's got appropriations from Congress, there'll never be an admission fee. So when you go drive your car up there, say, oh, I didn't know there was an admission fee. Oh, this is not an admission fee. This is to park your car. Well, where can I park my car for free? Well, Keystone, can you walk 2 miles? So it's just it's got the locals a little agitated about that as well. Well, of course, Guts and Borglum did not want this to be a roadside attraction to cause all kind of junk to happen. But 3 miles away, 2 miles away at Keystone, lots has happened. You go down there and there's motel rooms everywhere. Mount Rushmore's White House Resort. What do they advertise? 1,600 motel rooms in Keystone as you do your Mount Rushmore. And I always used to look at this and think this is nothing but cheap exploitation of Mount Rushmore. But then I realized all these things talk about Mount Rushmore and history and presidents. There's a museum to Borglum, museum to Mount Rushmore. Maybe they really remind the customers, the visitors, what this is all about. Now some go over the top, I think. You have here the Rushmore aerial tramway and the Rushmore slide. Now I'm not sure how they tie into patriotic themes, but they're there as well. So Mount Rushmore is exploited, and we as locals, at least speaking from my local viewpoint, I'm a little disgusted by some of this stuff. Now Rapid City's even gotten to the game. If you've been to Rapid City, the gateway to Mount Rushmore, the gateway to the Black Hills, they now have got a president on every corner in town. 43 presidents, past presidents, are commemorated in what they call the City of Presidents. On the one hand, you could say they're just trying to piggyback on Rushmore and get more people to stay longer, which is true, but many people who are involved in this in Rapid City really take this to heart. The person here happens to run this, Franklin Roosevelt, owns this furniture store, and he just loves Roosevelt, gets emotional over it. And he was one of the first guys to put one up because he wanted Roosevelt. Well, they paid for it themselves. And it's interesting, whatever we think about it, this past President's Day, the local paper wrote that the USA Today's Reader's Choice list for best presidential attraction in 2014 voted Mount Rushmore and the City of Presidents, Rapid City, the best presidential attraction. And then this came up last summer, Independence Hall between Rapid City and I don't know what the hell it was, pardon me. I'm not sure what their success will be. They're supposedly recreating the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which, as you know, is a very problematic issue to begin with. Perhaps if we think about legacies of Mount Rushmore, this is the largest legacy. 6 miles away, Korjak Joukowsky has been carving, or he's dead, the Joukowsky family have been carving Chief Crazy Horse, the great medicine man. Started in 1948, inspired, he says, by Henry Standing Bear. Korjak Joukowsky was a sculptor, not nearly as famous as Borglum, supposedly worked with Borglum for 19 days before Borglum threw him out. He went and now he's carving this. And really this is a popular stop, another mountain carving that represents another group of individuals within the Black Hills. See all the people at the top there? This is my wife's picture, and this is an elder hostel, I mean not elder hostel, a Volksmarch. If you ever want a Volksmarch, you can hike up to the top of Crazy Horse. Well, There's my wife and I on George Washington's head. I've been up there a couple times thanks to the graduate class I've been teaching. And what's the moral of our story? What's about interpretation? But talked about the Flagler said at the start of the talk. I talked about how the interpretations have kind of changed about development, preservation, how they've been added to. In fact, I think it's whatever you take away from it. Mount Rushmore is a special place. It means a lot to many people, including me. And I thank you for your attention. I do need to point out the South Dakota State Historical Archives, digital archives provided all the digital historic images. My wife provided several in the National Park Service. Thank you. Okay.
Questions?
What questions do I have?
$900,000
Mhm.
was the total amount. And the money was finished in the mid-30s.
It was finished in 1941.
Okay, so 41. I'd love to find out what that would equate.
Oh yeah, I should do that, shouldn't
It's a
I?
lot of money for
Yeah.
what it is.
Well, it is, and you think about what it means to the state, 2.5 to 2.6 million visitors a year, and they're all paying each car is paying $11 to park. and the Park Service doesn't get that money. That goes to what's called the Mount Rushmore Society. The Mount Rushmore Society did put up the money to put up the new concession building and the visitor centers, and they're the people who put up the $250,000 to put the vault up in the Hall of Records. And one time they were talking about putting an education building there. When I was teaching classes there, it was horrible. We were using one of their huge auditoriums, and I had 30 students. Anyway, they need an education building, which I hope the Mount Rushmore Society will use some of that $11 to put up someday. Other questions?
Question back here.
Do they make any efforts to keep it preserved as far as like in New Hampshire, the man on the mountain fell off and things like that? I mean, are they
Yes,
keeping it up?
the question is how do they make an effort to keep it preserved? There are continual concerns about cracks, water gets in the cracks, and freezing and expansion. They don't want to lose any parts of it. Park Service is very diligent on this. Every year, if not twice a year, they go up there and check all that. They have movement meters up there. They've been able to define exactly how many blocks of stone are up there. And up there, if you go up there, there's little meters. They can tell you exactly how much each stone block is moved. Then they seal every crack. And then down below, they can even do a laser read to tell you if any of the rocks are shifting. So they're there to make sure the thing holds together through eternity. And hopefully that'll be successful. Also, just recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, some German company came over and said, you know, you're getting some moss and other stuff on the mountain you may not want. We'll blast it off with our new high-pressure washing devices. They said, sure, and they washed it. And on some people says it looks brighter. I can't tell. Someday the monument will probably become the same 500,000 years, the same color as the surrounding rock. Yes?
How did Hitchcock get permission to film North by Northwest?
He didn't. The question is, how did Hitchcock get permission to film North by Northwest? He went to the Park Service, and he said he wanted to film this movie there, of course, and and they said you could not use any part of the memorial in your filming. And he was quite adamant. He wanted to be up in the faces. And why did he need the faces? He didn't need that memorial. He could have filmed that. Never mind. But they wouldn't let him up there. Now, you saw Cary Grant killed in the dining room. That was actually killed in the dining room. That was the old Buffalo dining room where I worked when I worked there in 1969. I was 19 and I didn't realize all those pictures of Cary Grant dying on the floor were happened. That's not a story. But that happened right there, and those scenes were filmed there. But when it came to the heads and being on the heads, that was all done in Hollywood in a studio.
Wow.
No kidding.
Yeah.
There's another question here. Yeah.
Yes.
Was there ever any objection to using a natural resource for carving in this way?
Has there been an objection to using a natural resource for carving? And now there would be, for certain. And in fact, I asked that of Ruth Drakowski at Crazy Horse, because, you know, when that started, they really got going in the 50s. We were a little more conscious of this, blowing mountains up. And you know what they did? They staked 2 mining claims. And so by making it a mining claim, they could blow the dickens out of it and nobody's going to say anything, because they're mining something. They're mining Crazy Horse, I guess. You can bet today if somebody came with this idea, it would not happen. Yes?
When's Ronald Reagan going to be?
I did have a few slides gathered up, one of George McGovern being up there, one of Ronald Reagan being up there, I think one of Daffy Duck, no, I don't think one of Daffy Duck. But of course, the Park Service hears that all the time, And they'll tell you, in fact, there's no more stone up there. We can't, go carve your own mountain someplace else. Yes, sir.
Because of what's been happening in the Mideast, are there efforts to prevent terrorism?
Well, yes, of course, are there efforts to prevent terrorism at Mount Rushmore? And they were greatly concerned about that. When we had 9/11, of course, security became much more intense up there. In fact, I make a joke about no free parking spots. Prior to 9/11, there was one small lot with 40 places you could park below the monument. When 9/11 came, they blocked it off, said for security, you could no longer do that. Now, all the rangers have, not all of them, a number of them pack weapons, they didn't used to. There are also more people with military authority there. And they really clamped down on the monument itself. A story I didn't tell was in 2009, a bunch of people from Greenpeace climbed the mountain and hung a big banner down to the right of Lincoln. It was critical of Obama. It said, "Stop politics, make sense, and stop global warming." And we got to go on top of the monument in 2008. And I was scheduled to go back up in 2009 or 10. And boom, nobody's going up now. If Greenpeace goes up there, shut it down completely. And so they have been concerned. They work hard to try to figure out ways. Now, if there's an airplane crash or something like that, I don't think you can stop it. But I think the mountain would survive and the airplane wouldn't.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Other questions?
Question way back here.
Okay.
Why didn't they finish removing the leftover granite like the sun wanted?
They just say that they finished the monument. The question was, why don't they do something with the leftover granite? I've often thought they could take that granite and sell it. Because I didn't talk about how this was made. They would drill down with jackhammers to within inches of where the heads were to be, blast those away. Okay. Then the last 2 inches, they would drill in honeycombs, drill close holes, and pry that off. And so much of that rock down below was this honeycomb rock, priceless to my mind, and they could sell that and do well by it, and then they would bump the surface to smooth it out. The Park Service said when we shut down in 41, we were done. Now, of course, they did the Hall of Records a little bit, but we were done. The debris stays. That's been the line since then. I don't think it'll ever change. And I wish, if I had my way, that it would be removed and sold. But then I'm a mercenary. Anything else?
I think that's it.
I'll hang around for a few minutes.